He inherited his grandfather's cabin high on a cliff and thought he would just clean it up and sell the old place dot. But when he opened the door and found a hidden stash of evidence covering up a terrifying truth buried for nearly 80 years, his whole life turned upside down. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. The wind carried the scent of burnt rubber and machine oil as Jamal Harris tightened the last bolt beneath the hood of a dented blue sedan. The shop was noisy as always. Air compressors hissing, metal clanking, men shouting instructions from one corner to another. Despite the familiar chaos, Jamal worked in silence, headphones tucked under his cap, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of the day. The music wasn't just music, it was escape. One of the few places his thoughts couldn't chase him with claws of grief. He was 20 years old, tall and athletic from years of lifting engines and dragging tires, his dark skin glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. His eyes were the color of deep oak, thoughtful and a little too old for someone his age. They said life carved its marks on everyone, but on Jamal it had carved early. His grandmother had been buried just 4 days ago. 4 days, and already the world expected him back in line, working, moving, surviving as though losing the only person who ever cared for him wasn't enough to shatter the ground beneath his feet. Grief hadn't hit him like a wave. It had settled in his chest like a stone. Heavy, permanent. Jamal closed the hood with a thud and wiped his hands on a rag that had long since lost the battle against grease. His boss, Mr. Keller, gave him a short nod of approval from across the garage. That was Keller's version of praise. Jamal didn't need more. His shift ended at 6, and as he walked out into the heat of early summer, he tugged his jacket tighter around himself out of habit more than need. In Tennessee, summers didn't forgive. Air thick and sticky enough to glue sweat to skin, but he barely noticed the warmth. The numbness inside him made everything feel slightly distant. He took the bus back toward his neighborhood, one of those places locals called Forgotten Corners of Knoxville. Rows of aging brick apartment buildings hunched together like old men trying to shield themselves from the world. Kids played basketball on cracked concrete courts. Mothers chatted on porches after long shifts. Sirens shrieked in the distance often enough that no one flinched anymore. It wasn't home. It was simply where he existed. His grandmother's apartment, the one he had lived in with her since he was 11, was gone now. A small collection of bills and hospital debts had swallowed everything she had. Her oxygen tank, her favorite chair by the window, even her record player with the scratched Aretha Franklin vinyls, gone. He stayed temporarily with a friend from work, sleeping on a couch too short for his legs. Some nights when he opened his eyes, he expected to see his grandmother's frail form in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked. Then reality rushed in, cold and sharp. After the funeral, Jamal had been surprised when a man in a suit approached him. The lawyer looked like he'd stepped straight out of a catalog. Shiny shoes, gold pen clipped to his pocket, tie knotted so perfectly it seemed mechanical. He introduced himself as David Rosen and handed Jamal a card embossed with silver letters. The firm's name meant nothing to him. He'd never had a reason to know lawyers before. "Your grandmother left you something," Rosen had said. "A property." Jamal had stared at him, stunned. A property? His grandmother had always struggled. Sometimes they cut the lights off, and he did homework by the hallway bulb filtering under the apartment door. A property sounded like something from another family's life. Rosen explained it patiently. Jamal's grandfather, a man named Charles Hayes, had owned a house in the Appalachians, deep in the mountains of Tennessee. It was isolated and old, and though legally still standing, it hadn't been lived in for years. When Hayes died decades ago, the property had passed quietly to Jamal's mother. But she never claimed it, never asked about it. And after her own hardships, after prison bars closed around her and illness changed her into someone Jamal barely recognized, all she had ever said about her father was never to mention him. Now the house belonged to Jamal. A deed had been signed, documents sealed. The lawyer would send them by mail, he said. You could sell it if you choose, Rosen added, his tone implying that might be the smartest approach. It's not exactly a vacation home, very remote, hard to reach. Jamal nodded then, but the words rattled inside him long after he walked away. Something about the mystery of that house lodged in his mind and refused to leave. His grandmother had never mentioned it. Not once. Why? He had no answers, only questions that weighed heavier every hour he ignored them. That night, he sat on the edge of the borrowed couch with the folded papers Rosen had given him lying on the coffee table. A cheap lamp cast a thin beam of light across the room, highlighting the embossed seal of the state of Tennessee on the deed. He stared at the signature written in careful script. Lorraine Harris. For the first time since she died, he let himself read her name without rushing past the pain. She had wanted him to have this, whatever it was. His phone buzzed. The name lit up the screen. Mom. He hadn't spoken to her in months, not more than a few strained sentences exchanged at the funeral. Hesitating, he answered. Her voice was raspy, as though every word dragged through thorns. I heard about the house, she said. You should let it go. Let it go. As though it were that simple. Why? He asked. Because there's nothing up there for you. Just ghosts, she muttered. He could hear the clink of a bottle, the sigh of smoke slipping through her words. Don't go, Jamal. Promise me. He waited too long to respond. She hung up. Jamal's jaw tightened. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked like a road map of his life's fractures. Everywhere he turned, questions, silence, and the hollow ache of not belonging anywhere. The following morning, before dawn broke, Jamal packed what little he owned into his old duffel bag. Work gloves, a flashlight, a jacket, and the small metal tin where his grandmother had kept her photos. He took her necklace, too. A simple silver chain with a small cross worn smooth over decades. He wrapped it carefully and placed it at the top of the bag. He left a note for his friend. Said he'd be back. Maybe. The drive into the mountains took him through winding roads flanked by dense forests where the sunlight filtered through leaves in shifting patches. Civilization thinned, gas stations turned into lone pumps beside peeling shacks, and the radio signal crackled away into static. The GPS on his phone insisted there was no road where he was driving. It urged him over and over to turn around, but he kept going. He reached a dirt path that angled sharply upward, too rough and narrow for his car. It looked abandoned, overgrown with weeds and branches. The mountains loomed around him, ancient and silent. He killed the engine and stepped out, pulling the air deep into his lungs. It smelled like pine, moss, and something older than memory. He slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and began to climb. The path twisted through trees, climbing higher and higher until the ground dropped away on one side, exposing the jagged teeth of rock and the dizzying roll of the valley below. He wiped sweat from his brow and kept moving, driven by something he couldn't name. When he finally saw the house, he stopped. It wasn't just on the cliff. It was part of it. Weathered wood blended into the stone as though a stubborn man had decided the mountain would bend to his will and carved his home into the rock itself. The porch jutted out dangerously above the drop, supported by thick beams drilled deep into the cliff face. The roof sagged slightly, but the structure held with a kind of rugged determination. A wind chime rattled softly, making a hollow metallic whisper. Everything else was still. Jamal stood frozen, struck by the sharp realization that this place had watched decades pass without ever being seen. He stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel, and tested the porch with his weight. It groaned but didn't give. The front door wore a chain and padlock, rusty with age. He reached into the envelope Rosen had given him. A small brass key waited inside. He inserted it into the lock. It stuck for a moment, then turned with a loud metallic snap. The door creaked inward. Cool, stale air rushed out, brushing his face like a breath from another century. He hesitated in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Dust coated everything in a thin velvet layer. Furniture stood exactly where someone had left it. A hat still hung on a nail near the coat rack. Cups rested beside the sink, cracked by time, but ready for hands that would never use them again. Jamal stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under his feet. He closed the door and listened to the silence settle around him like a second skin. This had been his grandfather's world, a life sealed in stillness. His gaze fell on a framed photograph sitting alone on a dusty table. A man in a railroad uniform stood beside a steam engine. The sternness in his jawline matched Jamal's own reflection in the mirror more than he wanted to admit. He reached out and gently picked up the photograph. Beneath the grime, he noticed a faint inscription handwritten on the lower corner. For my Lorraine, always waitin' for the whistle. Jamal's chest tightened. His grandmother had known this man deeply enough to hold on to his love all these years, so why had she never spoken his name? A floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around instinctively, breath caught in his throat. But the room was empty. Just an old house shifting in the afternoon heat. At least, that's what he told himself. He walked farther, exploring every shadowed corner. There were maps pinned to the wall marked with routes winding through mountains, a shelf filled with manuals on machinery and railroad operations, a stack of newspapers about mining strikes, torn and yellowed, and on the far wall, a large window revealed a view so breathtaking it felt unreal. The valley stretching endlessly, treetops like a sea of green waves rippling in the wind. He stood there, mesmerized, feeling his heartbeat slow. For the first time in weeks, his grief loosened its grip, the stone in his chest shifting ever so slightly. Here, above the noise and the chaos of the city, he could breathe. He didn't know how long he stood by that window, long enough for the sun to slide lower, painting the world in shades of gold and copper, long enough for the air to cool and dusk to creep across the room like a curtain falling. When he finally moved, he returned to the front room and sat on the old couch. The springs complained, but the seat held his weight. He let his eyes close for just a moment, the quiet strangely comforting. He wasn't sure when sleep claimed him. Only that sometime in the night he woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching gravel just beyond the door. His heart slammed against his ribs. He sat up, blinking hard, staring through the darkness. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched, taut as a wire ready to snap. Someone was out there, watching. Jamal held his breath. Seconds dragged by, a minute, another. Then, finally, the sound of retreating steps fading into the night. He remained frozen long after they were gone, pulse refusing to calm. He didn't move again until the first light of dawn slipped through the window. The house felt heavier that morning, as though the mountain itself waited for his next decision. He stood, stretched his stiff limbs, and walked to the door. Outside, the view of the valley looked peaceful, untouched. No footprints marked the gravel, no sign of intrusion, but he knew what he heard. Someone else knew about this house. Someone else wanted to be near it. Jamal tightened his jaw and looked back at the silent rooms inside. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a mystery carved into stone and wood, built by a man who had shut himself away from the world and taken his secrets to the grave. Jamal wasn't leaving. Not yet. He had come for answers. And the mountain was whispering that the truth waited deeper than he could yet imagine. He stepped fully into the doorway, the morning light casting his shadow long and dark across the porch. Somewhere, far below, a hawk called out as it soared over the treetops. Jamal inhaled deeply, feeling the crisp mountain air burn his lungs in the best possible way. Whatever lay ahead, he knew only one thing for certain. He would not run from this legacy, not anymore. Morning settled over the mountains slowly, as though the sun itself tread carefully across the rugged peaks and dense forests that surrounded the lone house clinging to the cliffside. Jamal Harris pushed open the front door and stepped into the fresh air, stretching stiff limbs and trying to shake away the remnants of the uneasy sleep that had gripped him through the night. The memory of those mysterious footsteps still pulsed in his mind, but the daylight gave him the courage he'd lacked in those dark hours. The world was too wide, too open, for fear to hold him in place now. He leaned on the porch railing and let his eyes wander across the valley. It was breathtaking. Layers of green rolling into blue, rising and falling like great waves frozen in place. Clouds hovered low, brushing the treetops in slow, drifting movements. He inhaled deeply. The air was different up here, crisp and cool even in summer, carrying the earthy scent of pine and stone. It felt like a place untouched by the noise of cities, untouched by time itself. Yet this peace was deceptive. The house waited behind him like a sealed vault of unanswered questions. He had come here for a reason, and now that reason pressed on him more urgently than ever. His grandmother must have intended for him to discover something she never dared to speak of, something his mother wished would remain buried. Jamal's fingers brushed across the key in his pocket as he turned back into the house. The door groaned shut behind him, the echo traveling through the quiet rooms like a reminder that he was alone here. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows and long beams that cut the dimness and illuminated floating specks of dust swirling lazily in the air. The familiar weight of silence settled on him again, thick enough to feel. His gaze traveled from the old hat on the wall to the coat rack to the small table holding the photograph of the man in the railroad uniform. His grandfather. The stranger whose blood ran in his veins. He picked up the photograph again, this time studying every detail. The stern lines of the man's face, the railway tracks stretching into the distance behind him, the tiny glimpse of a wedding ring on his hand, a man rooted in work and duty, a man who, according to his mother, should never be mentioned. Why? Jamal set the photo down and moved toward the hallway. Each step made the floorboards sigh beneath his weight. The walls were lined with framed maps, detailed topographical renderings of the surrounding mountain. Marked trails, symbols he didn't understand, arrows pointing toward mine shafts and railway lines that hadn't been used in decades. Some maps were newer than he expected. Others so brittle he feared they would crumble if touched. He opened a drawer beneath them and found small notebooks inside. Some filled with neat handwriting, others blank but stained as if they had once traveled through rain and dirt. He flipped through the first notebook he grabbed, hoping for clues, but the entries seemed like an engineer's ledger: dates, machinery codes, fuel supplies, inspections at railway junctions, all factual, no emotion, no personal confessions. He closed the notebook and continued deeper into the house. The kitchen was small but meticulously arranged. Pots hung above the stove, plates stacked neatly in the cupboard, a kettle rusted by time but still resting on its place on the stove's iron grates. He ran his fingers across the cluttered counter and felt the texture of dried grains of flour and crumbs hardened with age. A life paused mid-motion. Past the kitchen was the living room with an old sofa where he had slept, still bearing the imprint of his weight. A crocheted blanket lay across the armrest, its pattern worn but lovingly stitched. He wondered if his grandmother had made it, or if his grandfather had learned to sew out of necessity, the mountains teaching men to survive independently. A wooden bookshelf dominated one wall. He scanned the collection: history books, local mining reports, railroad manuals, engineering guides, and one unexpected row of religious texts. He noticed a Bible marked with a thin purple ribbon. His grandmother had kept a Bible too, pages soft from years of reading. The thought struck him with a sudden pang of longing. He wished she were here now. She would know where to start, what to trust, what to fear. He climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The steps complained with loud creaks as though warning him that this place was built not to be disturbed. At the top of the stairs, he found a hallway lit by sunlight that poured through a single window, revealing a view of the rocky cliff just feet away. The hall led to 2 rooms. He opened the door to the first. It had been his grandfather's bedroom. The bed was small, the blanket tucked tight as if awaiting inspection. A set of clothes hung in the open wardrobe: work shirts, denim, a pair of suspenders, and boots that sat neatly beneath them, covered in a fine layer of gray dust. A nightstand held a pocket watch frozen at a particular time, its cracked face shielding motionless hands pointing eternally at 11:57. Next to it, a silver ring lay untouched. Jamal stared at it, wondering if his grandmother ever missed that ring on the hand she no longer held. He turned toward a small wooden desk by the window. Papers rested in stacks, yellowed and curling at the edges. A pencil sharpener clamped to the edge. A map spread open with precise marks and trails leading toward the ridge. And there, beneath the corner of the map, he noticed the faint pattern of a watermark, the letters U.S. printed near a seal that had faded almost into oblivion. Government work, perhaps, something official, something controlled. He reached for the drawers next. Empty. All except one, the bottom drawer, which he tugged open carefully. Inside was a single leather-bound book secured with a brittle strap. A journal. His hands trembled as he lifted it. Unlike the ledgers downstairs, this book felt personal. It contained a voice. His grandfather's voice. But he hesitated to open it. Part of him feared what he might uncover. Truth carried weight, sometimes too heavy for one person to hold. Yet the curiosity pressing at his ribs wouldn't allow hesitation for long. He cracked the cover open and immediately caught the scent of old paper and ink that had survived decades in silence. The handwriting was stiff but tidy, the ink dark and unbroken. The first entry dated back to 1973. His grandfather wrote about long days working on the mountain railway, the satisfaction of a well-run machine, pride in maintaining the lifeline that kept the mining town alive. But woven between the lines was an undercurrent of caution, references to unsafe tunnels and men disappearing after shifts. A repeated phrase, "They tell us nothing." Jamal's brows drew together as he continued reading. Gradually, the tone shifted. A name appeared, William Rolls, owner of the mine, a name that would return again and again, always accompanied by a sense of dread in the words. "Rolls denies everything," one entry read. "Says accidents are just that. But too many families mourn, too many nights stay silent." He closed the journal carefully, as though afraid the words might spill out and change the world around him. There was more inside that book. He'd feel it like pressure building behind a locked door, but he also sensed danger in those pages. This wasn't merely the story of a working man. This was the story of a man watching something go terribly wrong. A loud crack startled him. The house shook slightly, as if something heavy struck the exterior wall. Jamal hurried to the window and peered down the cliffside. His heart leapt into his throat. Rocks clattered and slid from beneath the house, tumbling into the depths below. The porch support beams groaned under the shifting stone. For the first time since arriving, he understood just how precariously this place was anchored. The house wasn't simply built on the cliff, it was built into the cliff. Every board and beam relying on the stubbornness of stone to hold its weight. And that stone was no longer as dependable as it once was. Jamal backed away from the window and pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to ward off the dizziness of fear. If this house fell, he would fall with it. But something about that realization filled him not with panic, but with resolve. Leaving now would mean abandoning everything his grandmother had left him to find. Running away would only prove his mother right, that he was better off not knowing. He couldn't accept that. Not anymore. Downstairs, he searched for food and water, finding little. Canned goods that had expired a decade ago, bottles filled with sediment. He made a list in his head of supplies he needed from the nearest town. He would go soon, but first he needed to understand the structure of the house. He stepped outside again and circled the perimeter. The foundations were carved directly into the mountain, beams reinforced by steel brackets. Weathered, yes, but far stronger than the brief tremor had suggested. The shift had likely come from loose rock, not structural failure. Still, he would need to be careful. He stopped when he reached a narrow opening carved into the rock behind the house. It looked like a storage alcove, shielded from weather by an overhang of stone. He ducked inside and found a coil of rope, a rusted lantern, and a set of old mining helmets. Tools leaned against the wall, a pickaxe, a crowbar, a shovel. Dust blanketed everything, yet the tools stood ready, as though waiting for hands to put them to work again. This wasn't a place created for comfort. It was created for endurance. He returned indoors as the afternoon light softened into amber. The shadows in the house stretched long and strange, but this time they felt less like threats and more like echoes of what once lived here. People who built and believed. People who risked everything. People whose stories had been buried beneath rock and silence. Jamal sat once more on the old couch and pulled the journal onto his lap. He opened it again, letting his eyes drink in the words of a man who had spent his life resisting something larger and darker than himself. The next entries brought him deeper into that darkness, hinting that his grandfather had discovered a secret about the mine and the powerful family that controlled it. The final written words on the page struck him like a blow. "There are things under this mountain that must never be forgotten. I can hide what I know, but I cannot bury the truth forever. For my family's safety, I must stay silent. But silence weighs heavier with time. If someone finds this, I hope they carry what I could not." Jamal closed the journal with trembling hands. Carry what I could not. The responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical force. Was this why his grandmother willed the house to him? Was this why his mother feared it? The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and charcoal. A chill swept through the room. Jamal stood and lit a candle he found tucked away in a drawer. The flame flickered against the walls as if the house inhaled life for the first time in years. He looked out the window one more time. The valley below was veiled in mist now, a mysterious world whispering secrets from its depths. The town lights twinkled faintly in the distance, reminding him that civilization was far away. He stayed by the window long after night swallowed the mountains. The wind howled against the cliffside like a creature unsettled. Somewhere beyond his sight, the ground shifted again, a subtle reminder that the mountain was not still. It was alive, and it remembered everything. Jamal placed the journal beside his pillow when he finally lay down. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound tugged him back from the brink of rest. Every thought stirred ghosts of the past. He felt the weight of what he'd read pressing into him like a vow formed without words. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would learn more. He would dig deeper. He would find the truth hidden beneath rock and time and fear. He closed his eyes, and the house creaked softly around him like an old man turning in his sleep. The cliff shuddered again, barely noticeable. The mountain whispered, and Jamal listened. Dawn arrived quietly, seeping into the house through thin curtains as if wary of disturbing the silence that lay thick over everything. Jamal lay awake long before the sun rose, staring at the wooden planks of the ceiling and listening to the slow, irregular groans of the house as it settled on the cliff's spine. His sleep had been shallow and broken, full of restless turns and dreams that dissolved the second his eyes opened. Yet he felt energized in a strange, buzzing way, as though the very air here carried voltage. The journal rested on the small table beside him, and he felt its presence like a pulse at the edge of his awareness. Whatever waited in those pages had already begun working on him, tugging at threads long buried. When he finally pulled himself upright, he glanced out the window. Mist still clung to the forest, swirling around the treetops like smoke lifting from smoldering earth. The cliff beneath the house was a black void disappearing into the morning haze. He wondered how many years his grandfather had stood in this very spot, looking at the same view and thinking thoughts that no one else had ever heard. The journal beckoned, and before he could talk himself out of it, he took the book onto his lap and began to read again. The first entries of this new section were more candid than before, as though Charles Hayes had reached a point where speaking indirectly was no longer enough. He wrote of long hours on the railway, work he had once been proud of. He had believed in the dignity of labor, that a man's hands and back could shape his fate. But that faith had begun to fracture. He described faulty equipment ignored by management to keep production high. He recorded arguments where men protested unsafe tunnel conditions only to be threatened with firings. He detailed quiet funerals, too many funerals, for miners whose families received condolences but no explanations. Men who went underground and never came up again. And then there was the day that changed everything. April 12, 1976, double underlined, written with a heavier hand. A cave-in. Not the first, but the deadliest. Charles had been stationed with his engine near the tunnel entrance when the alarms blared. Miners stumbled out, coughing, bleeding, screaming that others were still trapped. But instead of a rescue crew being sent in, Rolls himself appeared with his lieutenants, barking orders that the tunnels be sealed. "Collapse is too unstable," they said. "The last shift is gone. Nothing more to do." Charles wrote that he had tried to fight them, yelling that he had seen a light down one of the shafts. Someone was alive. But Rolls and his men overpowered any dissent. A steel gate was lowered, bolts were locked. Silence fell where there should have been hope. 9 men remained inside. The mine swallowed them whole. The journal described how Charles returned home that night with blood on his clothes and a grief so violent it made his hands shake. He could still hear the pounding of fists from beneath the earth, still hear the muffled cries turning into silence. "Their voices," he wrote, "will haunt me for the rest of my life." Jamal shut the book and pressed his palm to his forehead, fighting off the surge of nausea. He looked around the quiet room, trying to imagine a man bearing a truth like that alone. It made sense now why his grandfather had chosen to live here, on the edge of the world. Distance was the only thing that could dull that kind of memory. He turned the page. Charles had begun collecting evidence after that day, determined to expose what had happened. He documented contract violations, photographed unsafe mine conditions, and discreetly followed Rolls's activities. It was dangerous work. Co-workers warned him. Strangers followed him. But guilt made him fearless. The journal showed that he believed a reckoning would come if only he kept pushing. Then came the threats. Anonymous letters. A rock thrown through the window of their house in town. A dead bird left on the doorstep. And one night, a message carved into the wooden fence in jagged letters. "Leave it buried." Charles was stubborn. He refused to bow to intimidation. But his wife, Jamal's grandmother, feared for their daughter. She insisted he stop. Charles reluctantly agreed, promising that he would not jeopardize their safety. But promises made against conviction are brittle. One day, he returned home bruised and shaken after being confronted by 2 men outside the mine's administration office. He didn't speak of what was said, but the next morning, he was gone. He left only a brief note saying he needed to disappear until it was safe. He brought the evidence with him. That was the last time anyone outside the mountains saw him alive. Jamal lowered the journal slowly, letting the weight of the story sink into him. His grandmother must have known at least some of this. She had kept the secret for decades, shouldering the silence so that he and his mother could grow up without those shadows stalking them. Yet, in doing so, she had denied them a heritage of courage as well. Jamal wondered if his mother had ever understood the truth fully. Maybe she had. Maybe losing a father to fear had shaped her life more than she wanted to admit. Anger, addiction, bitterness, it all had roots somewhere. Maybe she blamed the mine, the mountain, her father, whoever he became up here. Maybe that was why she warned Jamal away. He closed the journal and stood, pacing the room. His blood felt restless, charged. He needed to explore more of this place, learn how his grandfather had lived afterward, what had kept him going. He descended the stairs and entered the living room, scanning the walls again. His attention lingered on a large framed map of the mine. It wasn't flat. The map included topographical detail showing the slopes, tunnels, and hidden shafts beneath the earth. One particular shaft near the eastern ridge had been circled in red ink. Underneath it, in small writing, were 2 words, "Not an accident." Before he could think too much about that, a soft knock echoed through the house. His muscles tensed instantly. Memories of the footsteps from last night flared in his mind. He approached the door cautiously and peered out through the crack near the hinges. A woman stood outside, wiping sweat from her brow beneath a cap. Her clothing was work-worn, but her posture upright and strong. She looked to be in her 50s, with sun-darkened skin and streaks of silver in her hair. She carried a tote bag full of what looked like groceries. When she noticed the door shifting slightly, she smiled. "Don't mean to scare you," she called, voice warm and gently accented by Appalachian cadence. "Saw the smoke from the chimney last night. Knew someone must have come back." Jamal opened the door halfway, unsure yet trusting enough to let caution loosen a fraction. "You know this place?" he asked. "Everyone round here knew Charles Hayes," she replied, stepping closer. "Name's Martha Green. I run the general store down in the hollow." She handed him the bag. Inside were a loaf of bread, apples, a block of cheese, and 2 bottles of water. "Figured you might need something fresh to eat. House's supplies must be long gone." Jamal thanked her quietly. Martha looked past him into the house with a softness that suggested familiarity. "He lived here a long time," she said, "kept to himself mostly, but he always had this strong air about him, like he was carrying something heavier than his pockets could hold." "You knew him well?" Jamal asked, hoping she might fill in the gaps the journal left blank. "Not well," she admitted, "but enough to recognize a decent soul. Folks said he had ghosts trailing him up and down that railway. Never saw him smile after a certain year." Her eyes dimmed with the memory. "But he never hurt nobody, and he sure did care for the people who worked those mines. Maybe too much for his own good." Jamal swallowed. The confirmation of what he had read burned beneath his skin. Martha noticed his reaction, and her eyes sharpened with something like concern. "Whatever he left behind, son, it wasn't meant to be forgotten, but you be careful. Rolls family. They don't like old stories rising up again. Some past, they'd rather stay buried with the coal." Before he could respond, she patted his arm lightly and turned to leave, her boots crunching against gravel. "You need anything?" she called. "The store's always open to a Hayes." Hayes. The name felt strange as spoken aloud, heavy, like a coat he wasn't sure he was strong enough to wear. When she disappeared down the trail, Jamal closed the door slowly and leaned against it. The house hummed around him with the echoes of old lives. He returned to the desk upstairs and opened a drawer he hadn't noticed before. Beneath a stack of outdated permits and receipts lay another map, hand-drawn and much older than the one downstairs. This one showed the mountain from above, with the ridge highlighted in bold charcoal strokes. A small X marked a point near the bend of a stream. The stream still existed. He had heard its distant murmur earlier that morning. Under the map, he found a wooden box with a clasp that resisted his attempts to open it. Frustration building, he slipped a thin screwdriver into the seam and levered the lock until it snapped. Inside were photographs, black and white, edges curled. Miners posing before their shift, grinning despite grime on their faces. Charles standing beside them, sometimes with a forced smile, more often with worry in his eyes. Then he found the darker photos, bodies pinned under collapsed beams, helmets lying crushed beside jagged cuts of metal, rows of graves without markers. Each image turned his stomach and clenched his fist tighter. Underneath the stack was a folded piece of cloth. He opened it hesitantly and found a metal badge inside, polished enough to reflect light faintly. The engraving read, "Brotherhood of Mine Workers, Delegate." His grandfather had been more than a witness. He had been a protector, a fighter, a man who risked everything for others. Jamal's throat tightened. He thought of the countless men who had died beneath the mountain, their families left with questions and lies. He imagined his grandfather bearing the guilt of surviving while they had not. The journal, the photos, the maps, everything pointed to the same truth. Charles Hayes had been determined to expose a system built on silence and suffering. And now that determination had passed to Jamal. He placed the badge gently on the desk. He felt a presence behind him, not literal, but the weight of expectation. His grandfather had believed the truth mattered. Jamal could not turn away now. He refused to let this house become just another forgotten relic. He refused to let his family's history be erased because powerful men wished it so. The sun was climbing higher, and the room felt warmer, charged with a purpose he had never felt before. Fear was still present, whispering warnings, but something louder now drowned it out. Resolve. He took the map with the red X and rolled it carefully, securing it with a rubber band he found nearby. He would go to the ridge. He would find whatever Charles had marked. Answers waited there. He packed a few essentials, grabbed a jacket, even though the day was mild, and slung his bag over his shoulder. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway and let his eyes sweep over the interior once more. The house seemed watchful, waiting to see if he would indeed carry its burden forward. He gave a firm nod to himself, or perhaps to the man who once lived here, and stepped outside. The wind rushed up from the valley and wrapped around him like a greeting. The mountains had been silent witnesses for decades, but now, as he walked toward the hidden trail, the earth seemed to shift beneath his feet with anticipation. The forest whispered secrets through its leaves, and the sun shone brighter through the canopy, as though lighting his path deliberately. The truth was no longer buried. It had chosen him, and he was ready to dig. The forest path narrowed as Jamal pushed deeper into the wilderness, following the faint lines of the old map that had been drawn decades ago by hands now long gone. The canopy overhead thickened, letting through only thin strands of daylight that flickered across the ground like restless spirits dancing between the trees. Rocks jutted up through the soil, and roots tangled beneath his boots, threatening to send him sprawling with every step. The stream that his grandfather had mentioned flowed nearby, its murmur a distant reminder that life had always moved here, even while truths lay still and suffocating under the soil. Hours passed in this quiet march. The air smelled of damp leaves, moss, and earth that had never once tasted concrete. The deeper he went, the more the world behind him seemed to disappear. No cell service, no roads, no voices. Just the unwavering presence of the mountain and the pulse of something hidden beneath it. The ridge rose before him like a stone guardian, its surface jagged, its shadows deep. Standing at the foot of it, Jamal felt a shiver crawl along his spine. This was the place Charles had marked. This was where the ground had swallowed men, and the silence afterward had consumed their stories. He climbed carefully, hands gripping rocks slick with moisture. When he reached a flat ledge, he stopped to catch his breath. The forest stretched out beneath him in vast, endless shades of green. The house on the cliff was somewhere beyond those trees, unseen but still tied to him like an invisible thread. He pulled out the map again and examined the red X. It was close, just a bit farther along the ridge. He continued, forcing his legs to move despite the burning ache in them. At last he found it. A clearing of disturbed earth where the ground sank subtly in a way no natural formation would. The outline of something rectangular lay beneath the soil. He knelt and brushed his fingers along the dirt, heart pounding. This was not merely a hiding place. It was a grave site, for bodies or for truths he didn't know yet. The more he stared, the heavier his breath became. The idea that he was kneeling above the very spot where his grandfather had once stood, determined to never let time erase the dead, filled him with a surge of reverence and anger. He reached into his bag and withdrew a small folding shovel. The earth was stubborn, roots clinging to it as though refusing to release what had been buried. Sweat dripped down his neck, his muscles trembling with effort. The digging consumed him. Each scoop of soil felt like reclaiming a stolen memory. 10 minutes, 15. Then his shovel struck something metal. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the silent woods. He froze, breath sharp, then brushed the soil away with trembling hands. A large, rusted hatch emerged, its surface marked by years of weather and neglect. Its hinges were sealed with corrosion, and a thick chain had once kept it closed, though the links now lay broken, scattered like snapped bones. Someone had been here. Recently. Before he could process the meaning of that, the sound of a twig snapping behind him sliced through the air. He jerked upright and spun around. A man stood just beyond the tree line. He was tall, muscular, with a trimmed beard and eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the forest shade. He wore a black jacket emblazoned with the emblem of a private security firm. 2 others stepped forward to flank him, one heavy-set and slow-moving, the other lanky and twitching with nervous energy. Jamal's heart thudded against his ribs. "Afternoon," the bearded man said, his tone dripping casual menace. "Looks like you're doing a bit of unauthorized landscaping." Jamal said nothing. His jaw clenched tight. The man stepped closer, boots crushing leaves and fallen branches. "This is private land, owned by Mr. Rolls. You're trespassing." "I inherited this property," Jamal replied, voice controlled, though his hands trembled slightly. "From my grandfather, Charles Hayes." The man's smirk sharpened. "Your granddaddy should have known when to quit. You might want to learn that lesson yourself." Jamal didn't back down. "I'm not leaving." The man's smile vanished. "That's the wrong decision." A flicker of movement behind Jamal made him turn, too slowly. The heavy-set guard lunged and shoved him hard. He stumbled, hitting the rocky ground with a painful thud. Dirt clouded his vision, but he heard the metallic clatter of the shovel sliding away. The lanky one grabbed the strap of his bag and yanked it away. The bearded man crouched beside him. "Whatever you think you're going to find here, it won't help you. The Rolls family has deep roots in these mountains, deeper than any body ever buried in them." He leaned closer, his breath cold against Jamal's ear. "So take our advice. Forget what you saw, sell the house, leave, and don't come back." The men turned and disappeared into the trees with practiced silence, leaving the clearing as untouched as before, except for the imprint of their threat lingering like a sour taste in the air. Jamal dragged himself upright, anger fueling the motion. His palms were scraped bloody, his heart pounding with humiliation and fear that refused to shape itself into retreat. He retrieved his bag, shaken but unbroken. They wanted him to give up. They wanted the story to die. That alone was enough to propel him forward. But he could not continue now. The hatch was too heavy, the daylight too limited, and the danger too close. He would return. Soon. But he needed help. Supplies. Information. With one last look at the metal hatch, he retraced his steps through the forest, every crunch of leaves beneath his feet punctuating a growing vow. He would not let these men silence him. By the time he reached the house, the sun had begun descending, casting long shadows that stretched across the porch like fingers reaching from the past. He poured water over his scraped hands and watched the blood swirl into rusty spirals in the basin. As sting and burn tingled up his arms, he forced himself to breathe deeply and think clearly. He needed allies, even if he didn't know who could be trusted. He stepped outside onto the porch and gazed toward the distant valley. The lights from the town flickered faintly, like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere down there was Martha Green and her small general store. She had known his grandfather and respected him. She had warned him, too. Maybe she could tell him more about the Rolls family, about why they had turned a mine into a tomb and a truth into a hunted thing. As he made his way down the trail toward town, he became aware of the feeling of being watched. Branches rustled behind him once, twice. A presence lingered just beyond sight. But each time he spun around, he saw nothing but trees, their boughs swaying lazily in the wind. When he finally reached the road, sweat-soaked and breathless, he found Martha's store bathed in the warm glow of porch lights. A chime rang overhead when he opened the door. The interior smelled of coffee and wood polish. Shelves held everything from canned goods to old postcards bearing images of smiling miners from a time that felt impossible now. Martha was behind the counter, counting bills and humming a soft gospel tune. When she looked up and saw him, concern immediately shadowed her expression. "You look like you've been chased by the devil himself," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked around the counter. Jamal managed a humorless smile. "Close enough." She ushered him to a chair and poured water into a glass. "Start from the beginning," she said, placing it in front of him. "What happened?" He told her everything. The hike, the hatch, the men, their threats. Martha listened without interruption, but the tension in her shoulders tightened with each detail. When he finished, she let out a long sigh. "I warned you, son," she murmured. "Rolls doesn't like anyone sniffing around his father's sins. That family buried a lot more than coal under that mountain." "Why?" Jamal asked. "Why would they go so far? Why kill men and hide the evidence?" Martha leaned against the counter, her eyes dark with memory. "Money, power, pride. Pick one, put 'em together, and you'll find a Rolls standing on top of the pile." She told him about the mine's old days, about families shattered, widows left behind, compensation never paid, and fear enforced through silence. When questions were asked, accidents happened. Sometimes the bodies were found, sometimes not. "Your grandfather tried to change that," she said, "but the more noise he made, the quicker doors shut on him. When he left for that cliffside house, everyone knew he wasn't just escaping danger. He was trying to protect the ones he loved." Jamal felt a heavy weight in his chest, a mixture of pride and sorrow. He didn't deserve to be alone. "No," Martha replied softly, "he didn't. But some battles leave scars too deep to show. Sometimes a man hides because he's the only one left to keep the truth alive." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where night pressed against the glass. "You should be careful, Jamal. The Rolls family is still powerful. They've got money, friends in government, and the kind of men who'll do anything for a paycheck. If they sense you're a threat," Jamal cut in, voice steadying, "I won't back down." She shook her head slowly. "Bravery is noble, but bravery without caution is just stubbornness wearing a hero's mask." He knew she was right, but he also knew he couldn't leave this unfinished. Not after what those men had done. Not after what his grandfather had sacrificed. Martha packed a small bag of supplies for him. Fresh food, a flashlight, a first aid kit. She refused payment, waving away his attempt. "You're fighting for more than yourself now," she said. "You're fighting for men who never got a fight." Jamal thanked her and stepped back outside. The night air greeted him with a sharper chill than before, prickling against his skin. The mountains were black silhouettes under a silver moon, looming with silent intent. He began the long walk back up the trail, aware that every snap of a twig or flutter of leaves could be someone following. Each step forward felt like defiance, each breath like commitment. When he reached the cliffside house again, he turned once more toward the darkness below, scanning the forest for movement. Nothing. But that didn't ease the tension. He stepped inside and locked the door. His reflection in the window was a shadow barely visible in the dim light. But in his eyes burned a resolve that belonged not just to him, but to Charles Hayes as well. The mountain tried to guard its secrets. The Rolls family tried to guard their legacy, but the truth had found a new voice. And as Jamal lay awake again that night, listening to the endless whisper of wind through the beams of the house, he vowed that whatever came next, no threat, no danger, no buried crime, would turn him away. The past would not be silenced, not while he still had breath to speak. Night lay over the mountains like a heavy shroud, and sleep continued to evade Jamal. The wind pressed against the windows with restless hands, and every shift of the house coaxed his eyes open again. He lay on the sofa, staring into the dim glow of the dying embers in the fireplace, counting the seconds between distant creaks as though they would form a rhythm that might calm him. But calm refused to come. His thoughts circled endlessly around the metal hatch buried beneath the ridge, the men who had threatened him, and the weight of his grandfather's unfinished fight. He rose shortly before dawn. His muscles ached from the climb and the altercation, but the stiffness only fueled his determination. He set the kettle on the stove and waited for water to boil, listening to the slow rise of heat until steam finally curled into the air. The cup in his hand stung with warmth, a welcome contrast to the cold knot in his stomach. He drank quickly and stepped outside into the pale morning light. The world below lay smothered in a blanket of fog, spreading across the valley like a ghostly sea. The trees emerged from it in jagged silhouettes, and the sun had yet to pierce the thick mist. The cliffs were slick with dew. Everything felt poised on the edge of something, the air too still, the silence too complete. He had supplies now, thanks to Martha, and he had a plan forming in his mind that felt less like an idea and more like a path laid long before him. The tools in the storage alcove behind the house, the rope, the crowbar, the lantern, had not been gathered by accident. They were traces of a mission interrupted by fear, but preserved by hope. His grandfather had been bracing for the day someone returned to finish what he could not. Jamal would be that someone. Before returning to the ridge, he knew he needed to explore every inch of the house. He returned inside, setting his pack on the table and heading toward the stairs. Instead of going up, he turned toward the back of the first floor where a narrow doorway had gone unopened since his arrival. The door creaked loudly as he pulled it open, revealing a steep staircase leading downward into darkness. A basement. He had not known the house had one. The air that rose from below was cold and stale, as though time pooled down there like standing water. He flicked on his flashlight and stepped carefully down the narrow wooden steps, each one groaning under his weight. Dust floated through the beam of light in thick swirls. The basement was small, carved into the stone itself. Shelves lined two of the walls, filled with tools, canned goods long expired, coiled wires and other supplies. Against the far wall stood a large wooden crate secured by 2 metal latches. It seemed newer than the rest of the room, less touched by time. He knelt and unfastened the latches. Inside lay 3 thick binders full of documents. He pulled one out and opened it on the floor. The pages contained photocopies of contracts bearing the Rolls Mining Company's seal, expense logs, missing worker reports, handwritten notes, evidence collected quietly, meticulously by a man who refused to let the truth die. Some pages were stamped confidential in harsh red ink, as though they were meant to ensure silence rather than reveal wrongdoing. Then he found the photographs. One binder held dozens of them, grisly reminders of the mine's horrors. Miners pinned beneath fallen beams, their faces frozen in agony. Workers on stretchers covered with sheets, blood seeping into the fabric. Widow after widow receiving a folded flag instead of justice. And among those images there were photos far more dangerous. Rolls himself shaking hands with politicians, exchanging envelopes with the law enforcement figures, leaning too close to influential men whose identities were blacked out with marker. Blackmail, Jamal realized, or proof of conspiracy. All of it hidden here like a second burial. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. Every image felt like a voice crying out, finally being heard after decades of forced silence. The last binder revealed something different, a series of sketches. Shaded drawings of tunnels deep under the mountain, detailed diagrams of a sealed-off chamber beneath the ridge. His grandfather had labeled them carefully, marking ventilation shafts, escape routes, and a final note written in a determined, slanted script. Not an accident. Not abandoned. Hidden. Jamal exhaled slowly. The mine wasn't merely the site of a tragedy, it was a shrine of wrongdoing, a lockbox for sins the Rolls family intended to keep buried forever. He closed the binders and placed them carefully into his bag. The evidence was his now, and he would make sure it did what it was always meant to do, bring justice. As he climbed the stairs out of the basement, the floor beneath him vibrated lightly, as though the house itself recognized what had been unearthed and braced itself for the storm that would follow. When he reached the kitchen, the first hint of sunrise gleamed across the windowsill. He took a deep breath and stepped outside, gripping his bag with the strength of someone carrying generations' worth of hope. The path to the ridge felt shorter this time, not because it was easier, but because his purpose drove him forward. The trees no longer loomed ominously. They stood like silent witnesses. The ground seemed to steady beneath his boots. Even the breeze that rustled the leaves seemed to urge him onward. When he arrived at the clearing, he fell to his knees and brushed aside the dirt once again, exposing the metal hatch. He unpacked the crowbar and jammed its edge into the seam. Rusted metal resisted him with a screech. Muscles burned. Sweat slid down his neck, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. His grandfather had taken this secret to his grave, hoping someone would find the courage to finish what he started. With one final wrench, the hatch ripped open. A breath of cold air surged upward, carrying with it the scent of dust, oil, and long-smothered history. A ladder descended into the darkness below. Jamal leaned over the opening. A lantern flickered to life in his hand, spilling light down the narrow shaft. Stone walls dropped into shadow that seemed endless. He climbed down carefully, his boots finding the rungs one by one. The sound of his breathing echoed around him as the world of trees and sky narrowed into a tight tunnel. When his feet touched the ground, the silence was oppressive. He held the lantern higher, revealing a narrow corridor reinforced with rusting metal beams and walls of jagged rock. He walked forward. Every step whispered against a layer of dust that had been left untouched for years. Old railway tracks snaked across the floor, leading deeper into the mountain. The tunnel curved, dipped, then opened into a chamber that made him stop short. Rows of boxes lined the walls, military-style crates stamped with numbers and coded markings. As he knelt beside the closest one and brushed away grime, his flashlight beam caught the lettering, Fort Harrison, Military Supply. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. These crates shouldn't be here. This was a mine, not a military depot. He opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was gold, real, heavy gold glistening beneath the lantern light. Bars engraved with 1947, Fort Harrison Treasury Division, each one worth more than he could comprehend. Enough to change lives, enough to buy silence, enough to bury truth. Everything clicked into place at once. The miners who died, the forced collapse, the sealed chambers. They hadn't died for profit margins or negligence. They had died because they discovered something they were never meant to see. This wasn't just corruption. This was theft on a scale large enough to warp history. Jamal closed the crate slowly, hands shaking. He backed away, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the discovery. But the astonishment quickly hardened into resolve. His grandfather had risked everything to expose this. And those men had been killed because they knew. A sudden sound cut through the chamber, the click of a boot on stone. Someone else was here. Jamal spun, lantern swinging wildly. Shadows danced on the walls. He reached instinctively for the only tool in his belt, the crowbar. His knuckles whitened around the cold metal. Voices echoed from deeper in the tunnel. Echoes of orders, harsh whispers. Flashlight beams pierced the dark ahead. The security men had returned. He extinguished the lantern with shaking hands and pressed himself against the jagged rock wall. His heartbeat thrummed so loudly he wondered if they could hear it. He waited, his breath locked behind his teeth. Light swept across the chamber floor inches from his feet, passing by without catching him. One guard spoke. "Boss, thinks the kid's onto something. We need to shut this down." Another growled, "If he gets out of here with anything, we're screwed." They moved on, disappearing into another corridor. Their footsteps faded, but fear gripped him tighter than ever. He needed to leave. He needed to get the evidence to safety. Clutching the binders against his chest, he slipped quietly back toward the ladder. Every inch of the climb felt like a lifetime, each step haunted by the thought of a hand grabbing his ankle, dragging him down into darkness. When he finally reached the top, he scrambled out and slammed the hatch shut. The metal clanged loudly, making him flinch. He buried the hatch again, with frantic sweeps of his boots, then grabbed his pack and sprinted through the woods. Branches lashed his arms. Stones tripped him, but he kept running until the house emerged through the trees like a sanctuary clinging to the cliff's edge. He burst through the door and shoved it closed behind him, locking it. His chest heaved as he staggered into the living room, tossing the binders onto the table. His skin prickled. Something was wrong. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. A window he was certain he had shut earlier now stood ajar, the curtains fluttering with the incoming breeze. His eyes snapped toward the floor, and there lay a muddy boot print. Not his. He wasn't alone. Before he could react, the front door shook violently. A heavy body slammed against it. Then again. The third blow cracked the wood. Jamal stumbled backward, searching for something, anything he could use. His eyes darted to the fireplace. He snatched up a heavy iron poker and raised it just as the door exploded inward. The first attacker rushed him, but Jamal swung hard, the poker connecting with a sickening crack. The man collapsed with a shout of pain, clutching his face. The second lunged, knocking him against the wall. The iron rod slipped from his grip. A punch drove into his stomach, forcing the breath from his lungs. Dizziness blurred his vision, but adrenaline kicked in, fiery and fast. He shoved the man backward and staggered toward his pack, toward the evidence. A voice thundered from the doorway. "Enough!" The security chief stood there, the man with the trimmed beard and sunglasses now pushed atop his head. His expression was cold, disdain dripping from every syllable. "You really should have listened." He stepped forward, his fist tightening around something at his side, a pistol. Before the man could raise it, the shriek of sirens cut through the air outside. Red and blue lights flashed against the windows. Tires screeched on gravel. The attackers hesitated, caught in the collision of their aggression and unexpected consequence. The security chief spat a curse. "We'll be seeing you again, kid," he snarled, then motioned for his men to retreat. The injured guard scrambled to his feet. They vanished out the back door, disappearing into the forest before a fist rapped sharply against the front. "Sheriff's Department," a voice called. Jamal lowered the poker with a shaken arm and stumbled toward the entryway. When he opened the door, bright lights stung his eyes. Sheriff Thomas Green stood there, tall and broad-shouldered beneath his tan uniform, worry etched into his features. "You all right, son?" the sheriff asked, stepping inside without waiting for permission. His gaze swept the damage, the splintered wood, the overturned chair, the blood drops on the floor. His jaw tightened. "What happened here?" Jamal swallowed hard, fighting to steady his voice. "They know what's under the mountain," he whispered, "and they'll do anything to bury it." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the table and the binders lying open, revealing part of the truth within. A grim understanding settled over his face. "You found what your grandfather died protecting." It wasn't a question. Jamal nodded. Sheriff Green inhaled deeply and holstered his weapon. "We'll get you somewhere safe," he promised, "and we're going to take this as far as it needs to go." Jamal's gaze drifted toward the summit where the hidden chamber waited, toward the ridge where secrets had slept for too long. "We have to finish what he started," Jamal said quietly. The sheriff placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "We will." Outside, the sirens faded, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the pines. The first light of dawn crept across the cliff, painting the horizon gold. A new day had come. But the war to uncover the past had only just begun. The storm that had swept across the mountains during the night left behind a sky washed clean and bright, the air sharp with the scent of rain and pine. Sunlight spilled through the windows of the sheriff's office in narrow beams, illuminating dust that danced lazily in the stillness. Jamal sat in a wooden chair across from Sheriff Thomas Green, his hands wrapped around a white paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the night had faded, leaving him hollowed out but not empty. There was something new inside him, too, an ember of purpose that refused to flicker out. The binders rested on the sheriff's desk, stacked neatly, though the pages within them still felt hot with the danger they carried. Sheriff Green studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth this young man could bear. "What you brought me," the sheriff finally said, voice low and measured, "is more than evidence. It's a reckoning." Jamal looked down at his scraped knuckles, still marked with dried blood. "So, what happens now?" Sheriff Green leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. His uniform stretched tight across his broad shoulders, and there was a deep tiredness in the lines of his face. "Now," he said, "we make sure your grandfather's story finally gets heard." He nodded toward the binders. "This goes straight to the district attorney, and then to federal investigators. We'll need journalists we can trust, ones who won't be bought or silenced." The sheriff paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "But until that happens, you're not safe." The words fell heavy because Jamal already knew. He could still feel the echo of that pistol pointed at him, still hear the fury in the security chief's voice. The Rolls family was a dynasty in the region, wealthy enough to bend justice until it snapped in their favor. They had covered up murder and theft for decades. One frightened ex-miner's grandson wasn't supposed to topple an empire. "Then we should move fast," Jamal said, his voice steady, "before they try to shut this down again." A ghost of a smile lifted the corner of the sheriff's mouth. "You sound just like him," he murmured. "Charles Hayes. Stubborn as a mule, but with a heart that won't quit." Emotion pricked behind Jamal's eyes, and he blinked it away before the sheriff could see. He wasn't used to being compared to someone admirable. His life until now had been marked by survival, not heroism. But if there was something good in him, something worth fighting for, maybe it was a gift passed down through the blood he'd once wished he didn't share. The sheriff stood and placed a gentle but firm hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Let's go. There's someone who wants to meet you." Outside, the town was already stirring, the early morning bustle hinting at an ordinary day ahead. But Jamal felt anything but ordinary. Sheriff Green led him toward the general store where Martha stood on the porch, wiping down the railing. When she saw Jamal, her face softened into relief mixed with fierce determination. "Good to see you in one piece," she called, setting the cloth aside. "You gave the devil a hard night." He couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. "I wasn't alone." "No," she agreed quietly, stepping closer. "You had all those men behind you, the ones whose lives ended in darkness because someone else wanted gold more than justice." She lifted her hand and pressed a small folded newspaper clipping into his palm. "This is the list of miners who died in that collapse. Might help when you tell their story." Jamal unfolded the paper. 9 names stared up at him, each unfamiliar yet suddenly intimate. Fathers, brothers, husbands. Men who had worked believing their sweat would feed their families. Men who had gone underground, trusting they would rise again. Their final breath had been taken in secret, their deaths used to hide crimes rather than mourn courage. "I won't forget them," he whispered. Martha nodded. "And now," she said, "neither will anyone else." Sheriff Green drove them to the county courthouse where the district attorney waited, already notified of the situation. Hours passed in a blur of sworn statements, secure rooms, scanning machines that fed the binder's pages into databases that couldn't be burned or buried. Every signature Jamal made felt like laying a piece of his grandfather's ghost to rest. But each form he completed also felt like a declaration of war, one he couldn't walk away from. As afternoon faded into evening, Sheriff Green arranged for Jamal to stay in the guest room above the town library. "It'll be easier to protect you here until the feds arrive," he explained. "The mountains hide a lot of danger, but here in town, eyes are everywhere." Jamal thanked him and went upstairs, dropping his bag onto the bed. Through the window, he could see the mountains in the distance, their peaks washed in twilight. The house on the cliff was just a shadow now, a memory perched on stone. But he didn't feel like he'd left it behind. It was inside him now, its secrets, its courage, its tragedies, all woven into the fabric of his heartbeat. He sat at the small desk and opened his grandmother's tin. Inside were the only pieces he had of her life. The old photograph of his parents smiling on a pier, a church program with his name printed beneath a faded dove, and her necklace, a silver cross worn smooth by years of touch. He traced the pendant with his thumb. "She wanted me to come here," he murmured, "to find him, to finish this." The room was silent, but he felt her presence in that stillness, proud and gentle. As night deepened, knock after knock echoed through his thoughts, the sound of fists against the hatch underground, the pounding on the house door during the attack. The difference now was that he no longer felt alone or powerless. He had allies. He had truth. And truth, when finally spoken aloud, could become louder than any threat. The next morning, a convoy of black SUVs rumbled into town, drawing the attention of everyone on the street. Federal agents stepped out, tall and stern in their dark jackets. They disappeared inside the courthouse with binders in hand. Reporters soon followed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, voices rising with questions that finally had answers. Within days, indictments were filed, subpoenas issued, arrests made. Lucas Rolls was taken from his mansion in handcuffs, his face twisted into disbelief, fury, and the sudden recognition that his family's legacy was no longer under control. His company assets were frozen pending investigation. Politicians connected to the conspiracy scrambled to distance themselves, but evidence of their complicity spread fast. The media swarmed Jamal, eager to speak to the young man who had cracked open decades of corruption. But Sheriff Green shielded him where he could, reminding the press that this wasn't a spectacle. It was justice. Still, the world watched. One morning, soon after, Martha found him sitting at the edge of town beneath a tall spruce tree, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the horizon. She sat beside him without a word at first, letting him choose when to speak. "I never expected any of this," he finally said, voice low. "I just wanted to know who he was." Martha smiled sadly. "And now everyone does." He thought about his grandfather sitting alone in that cliffside house, burdened by truth, separated from those he loved because he chose what was right over what was safe. Jamal felt the ache of that isolation, the price of conviction. Yet he also felt his grandfather's strength in every headline printed now, every life that would be protected because the mine was no longer a weapon, but a monument. "They're turning the shaft into a memorial," Martha continued, "a place where families can come remember who they lost. Sheriff said they want you to help lead the dedication ceremony. You're the reason this is happening." Jamal stared at his hands for a long moment. His knuckles had healed, but faint scars still traced his skin, a reminder that truth often demanded a toll. "I'll do it," he said. The dedication took place on a warm afternoon. The ridge was no longer a hidden grave. A banner fluttered in the breeze above a polished plaque engraved with 9 names that would no longer be forgotten. Candles flickered beneath each engraving, flames trembling like whispers of souls awakening after too long in darkness. Families gathered, some with tears streaming, others clutching memorial flowers. Reporters stepped back respectfully, capturing the moment quietly. Jamal stood before the crowd, wearing his grandfather's badge pinned to his chest. He cleared his throat, gripping the podium with steady hands. "My grandfather believed that every worker deserved to come home," he said. His voice carried across the clearing, grounded by emotion but unshaken. He spent his life fighting for that belief, even when it cost him everything. This memorial isn't just for those who died here. It's for everyone who ever stood up against what was wrong and chose to do what was right. Their courage is still alive, and today we honor it." He stepped back, and the crowd erupted into applause, not of celebration, but of gratitude, of recognition, of release. The applause flowed around him like a wave, and he felt something loosen inside him. A wound he had carried since the day his grandmother died finally began to heal. Afterward, he walked to the cliff's edge and looked out across the valley. The wind brushed his face, cool and familiar. The mountains no longer seemed ominous or suffocating. They felt open, expansive, like a horizon instead of a wall. Sheriff Green approached with a hand extended. "We could use someone like you in community outreach," he said, "helping families of miners, preserving the history here." His smile was kind but firm. This could be a place to build something new. A place to build something new. Jamal looked back toward the memorial, toward the people who had stood there mourning and healing together, toward the road that led toward the house, his house, where courage had once taken refuge. He felt his grandmother's cross warm in his pocket, like a heartbeat. "I'd like that," he said, and he meant it. Later that evening, he returned to the house on the cliff. The sheriff had arranged repairs to the door and windows. Fresh wood sealed new strength into the old structure. Inside, the rooms no longer felt like relics. They felt like a home wakened from a long sleep. He lit a candle and set it in the window. The flame's glow spilled outward into the dusk. He sat at his grandfather's desk and opened the journal one last time. The final page contained a single sentence that he hadn't noticed before, so faint he wondered how he'd missed it. "For the ones who come after, leave the world better than you found it." Jamal closed the journal gently. He stood and walked to the porch, letting the last light of evening settle on his skin. The mountains breathed around him, alive with possibility. He spoke softly into the wind, not needing anyone to hear but knowing someone did. "I will." The house on the cliff stood strong beside him, no longer a place of hiding, but a beacon. The truth was no longer buried. The fear that once guarded it had been shattered, and within, Jamal burned a steady flame of purpose that would guide him forward for the rest of his life. The sun dipped low, casting the sky into shades of copper and violet. The valley below shimmered beneath the peace that had finally returned. And as night rose gently to take its place, Jamal Harris stood where his grandfather had once stood, with the courage to face whatever tomorrow might bring, and the promise that the past would never again be silenced. If this story moved you, imagine what the next one will reveal. Don't leave now. Hit subscribe, tap the bell icon, and dive into more unbelievable true-life mysteries on our channel. Share this video with someone who needs hope today, and help us spread the truth further than fear ever could.